Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more Autobiography of a Freedom Writer. We are reading Chapter 2, The Environment. Let's jump into it. Black Mississippians resisted the undoing of their rights as American citizens through the practical means available to them. The early freedmen who set out to establish all black towns like Lucas were publicly affirming their personal dignity and self-worth. These were places where blacks could gain back their respect. They did not have to wait for a cashier to finish serving white folks before they were served. They did not have to go off the sidewalk to let someone else pass. In Lucas, we were proud to express our knowledge of our history. We were taught that our ancestors believed they could govern themselves as effectively as, if not better than, the white establishment. We thought of our founders as forthright people determined to advance themselves and their future. Unfortunately, the price that all important commodity cotton began to bottom out in the early 20th century, and by the mid 1950s, many all black towns were suffering severe economic decline. Mound Bayou, one of the largest such towns in the Delta region to the north of us, managed to survive. For a while, Lucas did as well. The westward journey across South Mississippi along US 84 carried travelers into the heart of our small village, which could be found rising from the flatlands about 5 minutes outside Prentice. Cars approached heading into a curve marked by no passing sign and another that read simply Lucas. People were often walking or crossing the street of that road. Most cars would slow down. Nevertheless, accidents did occur. One Sunday when I was 5, I witnessed the tragic loss of a cousin, Shirley Maud Collins, who was 1 year older than I. She was struck and killed as she ran home from church. The 50 or more households in Lucas were bound by a handful of locally owned shops and stores. Most families owned a truck, very few did not have a vehicle in which to get around. The highway divided the community into halves. Even so, we were like one big family. Furthermore, we were each descended from a small group of freedmen, which meant that most of us were related to each other. The resilience of the black Southerner in the face of a separate and unequal society lay in the talent and resourcefulness acquired in managing to survive. Our teachers, cultivated and confident, were not unlike leaders in the community. They made it their business to teach the younger ones what they knew. The same was true for almost any adult in our world. The church fathers, Sunday school teachers, our parents, and the athletic coaches, the older guys in the neighborhood who challenged and guided us into maturity. Teachers confirmed their belief in us. They pushed us to excel. My primary teacher in elementary school was Aunt Mabel, who kept a close eye on me. If I misbehaved, she would take care of me, and she never failed to tell my mother, Aunt Valdra. After all of that, my favorite uncle, Alonzo Armstrong, would find out and chastise me all day long. As I can remember, I misbehaved only once or twice. Needless to say, I was a model student. I was smart and I excelled academically because of Aunt Mabel's skill. I was allowed to bypass one grade level. The teacher's high expectations, together with the nurturing and learning we received at home, created an environment that bred not only survival but growth and achievement. The accumulated effect spawned a vitality that averted the white supremacist attention of rendering us inferior. Professor J. H. Armstrong, my mother's cousin, and his wife, Adela Tops Armstrong, ran a country store with a hand pump gas tank outside. They sold a few groceries and other supply items. Majority of their customers made most of their purchases on credit. The couple was generous in extending credit. Their son would inform me years later. The professor and his wife alternated their schedules so one could operate the store while the other was teaching school or was busy elsewhere. He was a graduate of both Rust College and Tuskegee Institute. He taught history at Prentice Institute, where at one point he was appointed principal. Cousin Adela was both an elementary school teacher and midwife. Professor Armstrong wore one more hat. He was an ordained minister. He was exceptionally knowledgeable and straightforward, and rarely did I ever hear him raise his voice. Like his occasional sermons, his high school lectures were spoken in a quiet monotone, which I admired because I, too, was a quiet person. And I had been blessed with the conversational ability to influence other people. The professor's example would inspire me later in life to teach my two daughters and granddaughter that one need not shout to be heard. Speak softly, but with meaning, I tell them. When you make a promise, do so quietly and always keep it. Such were the lessons I learned from the elders in Lucas, who also shared their skills and talents with the younger ones. As the fortunate recipients of their knowledge, we would make time to watch and listen. For example, it was nothing to find a bunch of kids hanging out with the local blacksmith, Hugh Norwood, on a Saturday evening. We were amazed at what he could do. Plus, he had a gorgeous granddaughter. He would have on his dark, fire-resistant apron and talk to me while sharpening the blade of a hoe or other farm tool brought into the shop. Many a customer would come in with a misshapen tool, not knowing specifically what they wanted done. He'd make it for them, whatever they needed. Handles for hammers and axes, or rounder, sturdier wagon wheels. At the start of fall, the men in Lucas would set the date to round up the boys and supply the elderly, disabled, and elementary school with enough firewood to last the winter. They'd call for us to meet early on a Saturday morning. After the wood was gathered and cut, the boys carried and stacked most of it wherever it was supposed to go. Sometimes it seemed we stacked enough wood to last a couple of years. It was the elders' way of teaching us to be responsible community members. We didn't talk about white folks much, mainly because there weren't any around. The closest ones lived 2 miles west along the highway in a town called Silver Creek. It was relatively close, our but just inside the boundary of the next county. Lawrence, whose population was mostly white and whose history dated well back into the period of slavery. Silver Creek had more businesses and larger stores than Lucas. The number of residents was twice that of our community, albeit still small, around 200. It was commonly mentioned by blacks in our area that the KKK was well represented there. There was one bank in Silver Creek. In addition to the local residents, it served the people of Lucas and other nearby black communities such as Spring Hill and New Hebron. At least once a year, my father or his brother would finance a new truck at the bank for use in the logging business. They would just walk in and say they needed to borrow the cost of a vehicle. The loan would be processed to be paid monthly or quarterly. Dad would purchase his vehicles at the one General Motors dealer in Silver Creek. He would purchase a GMC truck, and his brother Clark would purchase a Chevrolet. The brothers had a running argument about whose truck was better. George Armstrong, my cousin, always purchased Dodge trucks for his operation. On the weekends, when those three got together, the arguments were so loud you'd think they were angry at each other. None of the three ever won. Their truck stories were a match for fishtails. Though I did not know it at that time, there was a Caucasian businessman in Silver Creek who became a trusted friend of my father. His name will not be mentioned here to protect the interest of family members. Some Saturday nights, many of the white men from the area would sit around his shop to talk and drink. Some were known Klan members. If decisions had been made in these meetings and were related to people in Lucas, Dad's friend would pay us a visit. He interacted with us free of any bias, compared to most whites with whom we came in contact. He was an exception. I know now that there were others like him. On the other hand, the tragedy of racial terrorism was not lost on the members of my family. The image of my disabled uncle, Ransom A. Armstrong, was seared into my young mind. Older relatives told me the story. One day, a bunch of white men waited on a wooden bridge along the highway that ran through Lucas. When my Uncle Ransom came riding along on his horse, they intimidated that horse so much it became frightened and threw my uncle over the side of the bridge. He suffered permanent brain damage in the fall. He was never the same after that. Another family story involved my grandfather, Thomas Edison Armstrong, Sr. Angry white mobs in the area attempted to lynch him, not once, not twice. Most people thought he married a white woman, Annie Evans Sutton, but my parents' mother was, in fact, a mulatto. She rescued her husband in both incidents. In one case, she is said to have convinced the crowd that she was not a Caucasian who had married a Negro, but she was a Negro. Although I did not witness the acts of racial brutality, the question of why they happened always lingered. Most weekends, Dad drove his truck into Silver Creek and I went with him, usually to pick up a few items in the stores to pay the bill. Occasionally, Mother would go with us. During the short drive, I would ask her if the bad people who tried to hurt my uncle and grandfather were still there. She would say, "Don't ever talk about that." I was never allowed to speak of those family tragedies until I reached manhood. I think most of the young men my age cried when we learned in the end days of the summer of 1955 about the shocking murder of Emmet Till. I was born in 1941, as was he, but Emmett was from Chicago and apparently didn't realize different codes of conduct applied in Mississippi where he was visiting relatives. He supposedly flirted with or whistled at Carolyn Bryant, a 21-year-old white woman who was married to an owner of a small store. Her husband, Roy, and his half brother grabbed 14-year-old Emmett from his great uncle's house. They took him to a barn, beat him, gouged out one of his eyes, and according to his mother, Mammy Till, someone used an axe to split open his head, and then they shot him through the head. They got rid of his body by tying a 70-pound cotton gin fan around his neck and with barbed wire and throwing his mutilated remains into the Tallahatchie River. Young black men in Mississippi at that time understood that any one of us could have been in this situation just because of a wolf whistle at a white girl. Black Mississippians did not accept such violent hatred lying down. What did they do? Never losing their self respect, they put on their game face. They survived by becoming some of the greatest actors in the world. Whenever they ventured beyond the confines of their communities, they worked hard to maintain that exhaustive game face. They were instilled with the wisdom of their ancestors, who tempered the rage of oppression with the expectation that if they didn't object, their children would live to see a better life. Though the older generation knew they had a specific purpose for the performance, the pain of pretending never lessened. More and more, I have come to understand why my mother thought her father finally gave up on life. The constant pretending wore down his spirit. He began to lose his self respect. He was no longer capable of looking his 10 children in the eye as he bore a burden of humiliation and would say, "I was doing that for you." We'll go ahead and end this part of the book there. But yeah, he gives you a clear look of how things are. And though it is not pleasant to hear about, he gives a very apt description of what happened to young Emmet Till after the accusation of whistling at a white girl. And we now know that's not what happened at all. She lied about him whistling at her. He was just outright murdered. Period. And he talked about having relatives who had suffered at the hands of uh, white race-based violence or just out and out lynching. It's it's a sad part of history. Even in my hometown here where I live, there's this big tale of a black man who was from this area but worked just across the mountain in Kentucky. He apparently was brought back here, just back over on this side of the mountain, and hung for, I can't remember exactly what it was over, but we have a road marker sign that talks about it, which I need to do at some point, show all the little road marker signs with all the information. But yeah, it just kind of tied into a moment like this. Not only that, there were supposedly uh, KKK meetings around this area back in the day. They're not near as prevalent, but that doesn't mean racism is dead. Far from it. There's still a lot of people who just willingly use racial expletives or just show they have hate for others of another race. But that's what he's talking about. He suffered from that kind of thing, and it is trying to give full a little fuller description of what life is like. But I'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.